Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
Welcome to Shaken Not Burned. I'm your host, Giulia Bottaro, and today we're going to talk about the just transition. As we strive to transition our global economy to a more sustainable model, we need to address this challenge not only to benefit the environment, but also all people. The just transition is about ensuring that nobody is left behind. It's about upholding human rights, minimizing negative impacts on workers, and boosting equality and opportunity. The need for a just transition is recognized in the Paris Agreement. Today, I'm joined by Gosbert co-founder of the Startup Discovery School, which delivers incubator and accelerator programs for early-stage businesses focused on sustainability and the climate emergency. He also sits on the UK Department of Business and Industrial Strategies SME Engagement Group. This group advises the government on issues and opportunities relating to entrepreneurship and small business. Another notable achievement is that Gosbert was included in the Queen's Birthday Honours list in 2022 and was awarded an MBE for services to business. So we're very honored to have you today, Gosbert. Thank you so much for joining us.
In the flesh, well, virtually, but it's great to meet you and really happy to be here today.
Thank you. So I gave a little bit of an introduction to the just transition, but obviously you're the expert, so I would love to hear it in your words and also how you're addressing this challenge in the work that you do.
So it's ultimately about ensuring that the benefits of the transition to net zero and, a net zero economy and a net zero world are shared equally with as many people and groups as possible, particularly those who are typically underserved. Now, when I say typically underserved, I think there's always an example I use that if you look back at history, there have been many transitions. The transition between the horse and the motor vehicle is one. The transition from publicly owned housing property to privately owned. There's been transitions, even historically, look at United States, between chattel slavery and emancipation of enslaved people. Now, unfortunately, if you look back at a lot of transitions throughout history, there's been kind of winners and losers. And typically the winners have been those who've had the most access to capital, so money, education, connections, social capital and the like, or representation, with those who lack those things typically having missed out. And as we approach the current transition to net zero, where we are all committed to reducing carbon emissions, living more sustainably, we want to ensure that those who are typically underserved, those who are most vulnerable, don't miss out on the opportunities that lay ahead. So for our approach, we look at the world, or we look at our work through an entrepreneurship, wealth creation, and real kind of business creation lens. The solutions or the challenges we face around climate change as the starting point, and further the transition to net zero, the just transition, are multifaceted. And we know we need solutions, we'll need new technology, we'll need new businesses serving a new world. And our work is primarily focused on supporting that entrepreneurial endeavor, supporting the next generation of innovators, change makers, entrepreneurs, however they label themselves. It's our mission to invest, support, and provide learning environments which allow these entrepreneurs to thrive. And that just can't just be about support. That also has to be about capital, unlocking capital where we can actually deploy this capital into those businesses to give them a fighting chance of growing, not just surviving, but also thriving.
So that's what you were saying earlier, to give opportunities to everybody, share the value and...
Yeah. And there's this often feels so far away. Being based in the UK, sometimes it can feel a bit like, oh, well, that happens elsewhere. But, if you look historically back at the United Kingdom, I mentioned the transition between kind of publicly owned property and privately owned kind of property, and home ownership. We live with the legacy of that today in the form of a housing crisis or a lack of supply in housing and unaffordability in housing. But also, if you look further just up the country to the north and coal mining, the transition away from coal mining, we still live with that legacy today in terms of some towns and regions in the UK who are still suffering the long-term effects of unemployment because nothing replaced coal mining as per se. The transition only went so far.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a concern. Remaining in the UK, I'm thinking of Scotland, which historically has had a lot of oil and gas production, and there are concerns that moving away from that will also not, as you mentioned, not replace those jobs.
Yeah, no, of course. And, typically entrepreneurship, when we think about it, business creation, and, it often isn't connected to the conversation. I look at it in a sense of we're going to need technology and new businesses to combat some of the challenges we're going to face over the next few years around a transition to net zero. But also we're going to need alternative employment, retraining, upskilling, places which we can kind of direct our efforts in a more productive way. So it's multifaceted. It isn't just about the impact of climate change directly, but also about what comes next. And I'm really fascinated in answering that question, really trying to understand what's that next step? What's the new world that we're going into? So yeah, this touched upon so much of our work. And when you look at the just transition, not just through an environmental lens, but through a more socioeconomic lens, you find really interesting pockets of issues which you never really encountered. Just even a few weeks ago, I met someone in London who had bought their formerly council property many years ago, only to be told that it doesn't meet current building standards, especially as we transition to net zero and further kind of obligations on house building quality and regulations come into place. They've done the right thing in inverted commas. They worked hard. They built they worked, had a career. They bought their property, only to be told you'll potentially have a stranded asset. Which again, who's affected by that? That's my question. And it's typically those who have least when we talk about the transition.
Yeah. And when we talk about, when we say just transition, it also makes me think of the words climate justice. So could you explain how these two concepts are connected?
Sorry, this is something which came up. I spent the last kind of week at Davos a couple of weeks back, and I had an opportunity to listen to so many talks, meet really interesting people. And I think walking away from that, and I came back. Oh, of course.
Sorry, just interrupting. Let's give a brief explanation of the World Economic Forum annual meeting at Davos, just in case our listeners are not familiar with it. So it's a huge event.
The layout being big stage, the main kind of World Economic Forum event with lots and lots of side events, and a lot more. Aside from the business and politics and media side, there's a real creative fringe to the event, more so than I ever realized, actually. So yeah, it's a place where basic business leaders, the media and policyholders and policymakers come together to discuss the future. Really top of the agenda this year, and has been for a few years, has been climate change, obviously the use of AI, and also the future of work. And, AI and climate change, two things which have a huge impact on the future of work. And yeah, so just spending the last week there or so, I came back with the idea of climate justice being, again, linked to the transition, confronting the issues of climate change and its impact, but doing that in a fair and equitable way. And a great simple way to look at emissions, the idea of emissions, which typically for many years was seen as the ultimate measurement of where we are when it comes to climate change. Well, if you look at many communities, even in the UK, carbon emissions are often put down to the idea of driving or car ownership. But you typically have, poor communities or underserved communities in the UK where car ownership is quite low. But however, they are facing the challenges of climate change now. The climate change isn't in 10 years. For them, it manifests in, let's say, housing, energy bills which are exploding, going through the roof, a cost of living crisis, homes which aren't well insulated, too cold in the winter, too hot in the summer, especially with temperatures becoming increasingly unpredictable. So climate change is really about tackling the issues of climate change. So climate justice is really about tackling the issues of climate change, but doing it in a fair and equitable way, acknowledging where people are, their circumstances, their challenges, and also their needs as well. Just recently I was speaking to someone and they were talking about the idea of doing less, being more sustainable, which is a great message. But that doesn't really land with communities of people who are already struggling. To ask people to do less with little they have is simply not fair. And that climate justice has to really embrace this idea. And often, I think, I'll be self-critical here as well, it often hasn't done that. It's been the preserve of those who are very well educated, privileged, have access to social capital, connections. The idea we're all going to do less, we need to conserve. Well, that doesn't land for everyone. That doesn't work for everyone.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the Davos meeting. So I'm thinking when it comes to global action, these big, massive ticket meetings with, the very top of the world, and COP goes in there as well. How effective are they in driving change when it comes to the just transition?
I had a kind of healthy skepticism about the usefulness of these meetings. And, the same critique is leveled even at the bigger United Nations meetings, the COP meetings, which take place every year. I think there is a value in bringing different stakeholders and different communities and individuals together to look at big issues from multiple angles. So even within Davos, there was definitely a big difference between, for example, spending time at Africa House in Davos, which has a real slant on Africa-focused discussions, and discussions around climate change there are very different to the conversations in the main hall and the main World Economic Forum or even other locations. So I think to bring people together to discuss a multitude of topics from different angles has great use. And even for ourselves at Startup Discovery School, we're going to be shortly issuing a impact report, which by the time this goes live should be out, and it will be accessible via our website, startupdiscoveryschool.com. We spent the last few years working on the idea of climate innovation and also climate justice, supporting entrepreneurs who are building technologies which both mitigate the impact of climate change, but also enable a just transition. And when I look at our work, we had in our report, 59% of our program participants, entrepreneurs, identify as migrants. We've got 44% of our participants who identify as BAME, so Black and Asian minority ethnic, as well as 31% of them being first generation university educated. So there's a real kind of diversity of people that we're working with and entrepreneurs we've supported in change makers. And I think to bring that to Davos, which often the conversation can be, more often than not, can be carbon emissions, how do we reduce it? Whereas I think we're able to bring a different angle, not just working from top down, but working from bottom up, working with communities of entrepreneurs, change makers, who are really committed to enabling a just transition and bringing it to life.
So you felt listened to at Davos around these issues?
I actually wrote a piece actually for the Pioneers Post, which you can put, feel free to share it after. Yeah, where, I could be quite critical of Davos in some elements, and it was a real multifaceted experience. Did I feel listened to in terms of what I had to say? Yes. Did I encounter situations where I felt that the message which I and others was communicating, the idea of looking at the transition through a dynamic, diverse lens, was always heard? No. And I think, the World Economic Forum, Davos, etc., doesn't operate in a bubble. It's very connected to what's going on around it. And if we look around it, we've got increased kind of nationalism, the idea, and resource nationalism too, the idea that we're going to look after ourselves. And this is very at the highest levels. President Trump, who started his presidency right in the middle of the World Economic Forum, has been clear about this. And I saw that attitude mirrored throughout the conference. So did I feel listened to? Did I feel like I was heard? Yes. Would I say that the wider message, especially through the mouths of others, was always heard? No. But I do connect that to the wider kind of political instability, increased kind of nationalism, and maybe, I don't know how to put it, but me first political environment that we find ourselves in. And the reason that's important is because ultimately, if we look at the idea of a just transition and climate justice, it can't be done by one organization or individual. It does require that multilateralism. We all need to work together, both nation states, governments, communities, and individuals. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of a concerning time, isn't it? Because events like COPs, which are, traditionally driving climate action, are all about cooperation, as you said. And the COP in December was the sort of the climate finance, where the big $300 billion reparations were agreed to the global south, essentially. So how do you feel we can go on now with how can we address the just transition in such a fragmented
when I think about the COP, I spoke to someone a few months ago who was at the original, one of the first COPs, the Rio 1992 conference, the Earth Conference, they called it. And, he was a negotiator for, I believe it was one of the smaller African nations in East Africa. And he said to me that, we negotiated on the basis that this agreement would ride the waves of political instability, which would naturally come over time. So we anticipated that there would be divergent views. Now, I think conversation around kind of COP and again, that idea of climate justice and what you talked about, the loss and damage fund and the financing they talked about last year to ultimately compensate states on the front line of the climate emergency. That's a conversation which we cannot ignore. And I think to think about the just transition as well as being about, social and wider economic justice is also about money and capital and who gets access to that. And it can feel a bit uncomfortable, but that does have to be brought into the conversation. And I think in a fragmented world, I guess I have a belief and a faith that the issue of climate change and the oncoming emergency, which we're currently in, is going to force people to the table regardless of our political persuasions. The speed in which we act, I think, is debatable. I think that's totally up for debate. But this is an emergency which is coming and is going to force us at some point to sit down, even with all the political instability. And I think back to the conversation I had with the negotiator, and his view was, this was negotiated more than 30 years ago. However, COP has given us a framework at least to sit down. And sometimes I think just the opportunity to sit down and have a forum for discussion is just as important as reaching an end goal.
Yeah. And bringing in Trump once again, there's currently a bit of an ideological crusade against diversity, equity and inclusion, or DEI. So, basically ordered all government agencies to stop hiring and preferring DEI policies and, calling it preferential treatment, which is obviously not. And so lots of companies are following suit. So, this is happening in America. Things here are still different.
There will be an impact. They often say if America sneezes, then, the United Kingdom gets a cold. That's the system we have at present. United States influence is unmistakable. Will this affect the just transition as a concept and even the more practical elements of the program? Yes, I believe so. I think how much is debatable. But the idea, and I think this is very much the political climate we're in, I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction to talk about the issue of climate change. I think it's become almost a euphemism for lack or doing less. So people hear the word climate change, I think, what does that mean? That means we've got to consume less. That means we've got to hold back. That means a lower quality of life, unfortunately, as opposed to the idea of transition, which is we're transitioning to new opportunities. We're moving away from, let's say, the petroleum to more clean energy. And in clean energy, there's going to be jobs created. There's going to be opportunities for all of us. So in terms of kind of DE&I, I think that will have an impact. The idea of a transition forces you to look beyond the headlines and look through the lens of equity, the idea of not just fairness, that everyone gets the same, but those who have the least get more of the support. And I think that idea of kind of equity is going to be hit, but you can't not look at a transition or the just transition as a whole and look through the lens of diversity, equity and inclusion. So yes, the impact will be harsh. However, I have a belief that this is very much the political moment we're in, and will be for the next few years. And it will be up for us to navigate it in new ways and continue to make the case. Why is diversity, equity and inclusion, or whatever you want to call it, why is it important? Because it uncovers talent, and talent is the heart of everything. It uncovers talent. It allows us to be more inclusive. It allows us to grow our economy. Some people need to hear that. It can't just be a kind of conceptual, we're doing a good thing. And I'm confident and strongly believe that we still have to make the case, regardless of what's going on in the United States and what will come here eventually.
So businesses could technically find a way to, continue DEI work without maybe calling it such. Or we find a new name. I don't know.
Labels are important. This work does need to continue. When I think about some of the initiatives we've been involved in, so to talk about, the UK SPF, United Kingdom Shared Prosperity Fund, which looked to kind of funnel government funding from central government into projects which ultimately improved our economy. So in our perspective, we worked on the idea of local business support, so supporting more local businesses, specifically in communities which typically don't receive funding or support to launch businesses. And what we've done over the last few years, create a series of interventions, accelerators, incubators, in partnership with the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and the Mayor of London, to really support businesses who will all have a sustainability lens. Now, the interesting thing is, many of those businesses would never have called themselves a net zero business, in inverted commas. But the theme of sustainability was quite widespread. We had people working on access to kind of financing, which would allow local shops and businesses to put up solar panels. We had businesses who were directly working in alternative materials and packaging to plastics. Like there was a whole raft of businesses, again, who typically miss out on this type of fundings. Diversity and equity inclusion really goes to the heart of the just transition, in my opinion. And we need to continue making the case.
Can you provide more examples of these businesses that you helped with your work?
Yeah, sure. So, a business that always comes to mind, and because it works really at the heart of the idea of a transition. And, I said earlier that it can be uncomfortable, but we have to talk about money when we talk about the just transition. We have to talk about funding. Who gets it? How are we going to allow communities to transition effectively to ensure that no one is left behind? An example I've got is Granite. Granite are ultimately a fintech platform. If I'd met them in any other world, they would be classed as a fintech platform. But they've got a really interesting approach when it comes to kind of the idea of kind of financial inclusion. And not inclusion just for inclusion's sake, but inclusion because there's opportunity. And what they're doing is ultimately providing an algorithm which allows businesses to receive a dynamic credit scoring. Now, these businesses typically are businesses who miss out on financing. But financing what? Ultimately, it's to finance the acquisition of climate technology, solar panels, in order to reduce bills, to make their businesses more profitable. Now, the problem they're dealing with is that this system of financing is typically ruled by banks who are more often than not cannot give a quick decision. I think the average decision time is about 12 to 14 weeks. Their algorithm can give a yes or no answer in a few hours, or maximum a few hours. I think it's up to an hour. This is a great opportunity for businesses to transition. Businesses moving from, typically, it could be your local leisure center. They want solar panels. They see an opportunity to reduce their overall cost. They can't access the financing. Granite have come along and provided the technological solution. I think that's a great example of a business who, in another world, you're a fintech platform. In this world, they're allowing businesses to transition effectively. Yeah, equitable. And there's probably another one I want to shout out as well. Another business, hardware, Ands and Walls. And we've heard about the need for all of us in the UK to transition to electric pumps, heat pumps, to move away from our current systems. Now, this is a great concept. I've met people who have very much talked highly of their new pumps that they've had installed in their homes and the incentives available to ensure that we are all transitioning. The challenge, again, is that when we think about heat pumps, and this is Ands and Walls, the business, have located this issue, or assuming people have properties which have space for the installation of new electric heat pumps. Now, not every property in the UK does. I think I spoke to a house builder the other day and they were saying that the average UK family is now about, I think, just under 2.0 now. So people are having less children, smaller family units, etc. So houses are now built in such a way to embrace this reality. Houses are smaller, not leaving much space for the installation of these pumps which are needed. Ands and Walls have come up with an interesting solution, which is ultimately reconfiguring the heat pump for the next generation, which is much smaller, thinner, easy to install, and most crucially, cost-effective and easy to maintain. And this is something they look at as a way to ensure that people living in social housing, social tenants, can actually join the transition and benefit. And why should they miss out? Because your property isn't big enough. Again, going to the heart of equity. What's fair? How do we make it fairer? And, this is, before doing this work, I think a lot of the time, even about 10 years back, the conversation around the climate movement and the transition was strictly through an environmental lens, which has value. I'm not looking to write that off. But I think a movement that we've seen over the last few years is very much embracing the kind of messy socioeconomic challenges around the just transition.
Yeah, ESG has the S in it, right? The social. Whether it's properly addressed or not is another matter, but it's very important, of course. It's equally important.
The wide climate movement, and I include the transition, we've been guilty of almost poor marketing. We've taken a very interesting topic, which is multifaceted, which you can blend in many different ways. And we've made it kind of boring. We've reduced it to ESG. And if you say ESG to most people, they don't know what you're talking about. It's like, what? And it's like that idea, we've taken something so interesting and we've boiled it down to something quite dull. So we're having to almost take a reverse journey, almost unpack it, almost, okay, start from ESG, then let's dial it back a bit and understand what does that actually mean when you dig. And I think on that journey is where you really kind of open up a whole raft of possibilities, opportunities, viewpoints, which perhaps have been hidden. And I get why we use ESG, simplicity, right? It's meant to be simple, but I think we've removed some of the color.
Yeah, it's a bit corporate, isn't it? But also when we include people, we also get more supporters for the transition, right? Because if, as you were saying earlier, you tell people just do less, like, fly less, obviously that's something separate, but, just live a lesser exciting life. But really it's about finding ways where we can all thrive in a better world and showcase the benefits. We try really hard at Shake Not Burn to help businesses understand why they should transition, and socially as well. As you said, there are multiple benefits for a business, right? With talent, as you said. Do you have any other examples of why a business should look at the just transition lens?
So why should a business look at the lens? I think there's different, in my head, I've got this kind of diagram, and it's like almost like meets the kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when you look at the hierarchy of needs as a business's responsibility, ultimately, depending on who you talk to, of course, for profit, its shareholders, whoever they may be, and to drive profit or revenue, whatever we want to call it. Now, certain businesses, in my opinion, feel a moral obligation to look ahead and say, how do we leave the planet in a better place than which we found it? How can we contribute to that in our own way? Whether that's through looking at our supply chain, looking at, our partners, looking at where we source materials and goods, and really thinking about the communities that we serve, both directly and indirectly. I think that's one way that you could make an argument on the moral case. I prefer not to make that case more often than not, because I think we have to talk in terms of opportunity. So where is the opportunity to transition? And when we think about the opportunity, when is the opportunity as well? Because it's just as important, when is that opportunity going to occur, as opposed to just where it is. A few years ago, I remember the reusable cups were a huge thing. Coffee cups, I don't want to name names or name brands, but they were a big thing. And I was just thinking the other day, I can't remember the last time I saw one. Maybe because we spend less time in offices, they're less visible. But, I can't remember the last time I saw one. That was Yeah. I think they're paper cups.
I still see lots of paper cups.
Yeah, that's right. I'm just like, wow, okay. But there's a real moment in time where reusable plastic coffee cups were a real thing that was seen as the way you take action. So I think in terms of why should they take action? One, there should be a looking ahead, business health, the almost morality of it. I need to make a contribution to this idea of transition. And secondly, I think that the second way I'd answer that question is to get businesses to look at the opportunity, to look within their industries, their customers. If their customers are young, they're becoming more climate conscious. They want to understand not just what the product is, but where it comes from and what's the impact on where it comes from as well. And we're seeing this movement across technology, phones, our laptops. People are asking hard questions. Where do we source the key minerals that power our loved devices? And there's been real backlash. We've heard a lot about divestment from large companies. So I think it's twofold, moral, but also opportunity. And for a lot of the businesses that we support, in terms of enabling a just transition, I think they've all been sharp at spotting what's the opportunity, what's coming next. Yeah, longevity. You don't ultimately want to be selling into a market which at some point in the near future will ultimately disappear. And that could be through multiple range of reasons. That could be firstly practical. Legislation's coming. Whatever you're selling, it will increase in cost or be outlawed or whatever it may be. Could be a declining demographic. Your core customer is getting older, so there's going to be less customers in the near future. Every business, I think, is forced to look at these challenges, regulatory challenges, also, and what's coming ahead.
So looking at the UK, do you think the UK is doing well in achieving a just transition? B, can you provide any examples of initiatives?
Yeah, I think this is the UK doing well? I would say in one sense, yes. I think there is an appetite, or at least a market, for businesses that are enabling a just transition and working on a range of climate-related challenges. And if you look around, you can see the amount of investment. I can't remember how many billion it was. PwC wrote that was invested in climate-focused startups during 2024. They released a report at the end of last year. You can see it by the range of funds which are being set up. just to name a few, the likes of, Zero Carbon Capital. They're not a fund. Innovate UK have got a huge climate mandate to really seed the next generation of climate-focused entrepreneurs. The likes of 2150, again, another venture capital fund, really focused on climate as well. So I think in terms of enabling an innovation environment, the UK has done well. In terms of, I think, and this is something which has made me reflect, as I said, the just transition at the start isn't just about technology, but are we, we need to be kind of tapping into people's lives, everyday lives. For most people who aren't doing this work, this seems, apart from the odd news article or something they see online, it can often feel a bit abstract. And I'm always a big believer that one of the blind spots in the climate and movement, and I include the just transition movement, is an understanding of labor and jobs that, right now there's been a huge push towards the green economy. We need more people in the green economy. And at its heart, that is a smart thing to do. There's a recognition at UK government level, even through the creation of the UK, I think it's a Green Job Task Force, that we need more people entering the green economy. Jobs which are related to both directly and indirectly mitigating the impact of climate change and enabling a just transition. One thing I think we haven't done well at is explaining that opportunity. There are a few examples of companies who are set up to do this, the likes of Greenworks, for example, who are retraining using their AI-powered platform, training young people to enter the green economy, take up jobs within, for example, engineering that don't require university degrees. And they're specifically focused on young people, again, who typically won't go to university or typically would miss out on this opportunity. So I think there's been a good move in terms of enabling finance and innovation. I always feel that we don't do a good enough job at explaining the labor market or the job opportunities which are coming. I think that often lacks. And when we look at issues around kind of long-term unemployment, in parts of the country, progress has been quite stagnant in terms of the amount of people still not in any education or further training. So I guess it's a double-edged sword. Yes, there has been great progress, but I think there's still some blind spots within the wider climate movement.
Can you think of any other examples of initiatives that work globally?
When I think about globally, some things that have been done fairly well. So I think I'd always look at South Africa. I always use them as a bit of a case study, only because South Africa have, obviously, not a small nation, I think of about 60 million people. But they had the challenge of being heavily reliant on coal, which ironically we're phasing out or seeking to phase out in the United Kingdom. Now, but they're also dealing with wide-scale poverty of the black majority in South Africa. So there is a racial and social economic lens to the challenges whilst transitioning. I think what they've been good at is internationalizing the challenge they face, using themselves as a case study of an advanced or developed economy which is seeking to transition to net zero, whilst at the same time providing some of their citizens economic opportunities and sustainable futures. So what they've done is form the South African Just Energy Transition Partnership. That is backed by international donors, but ultimately looking to facilitate the move of coal whilst providing mass training, education, and skills development for the population in relevant job sectors which align to their transition strategy. This has been forced upon South Africa due to its challenges that it faces. And it's going through all the hardships of, rolling blackouts, load shedding, whilst at the same time seeking to transition. So yeah, that's a great example of a multifaceted project, which I look at and think really interesting, really looking at kind of how do we tackle this complex problem whilst at the same time providing economic opportunity for our citizens. And, I'm going to also probably mention another project, which Startup Discovery School are involved in. Now, it's actually outside the UK, based in Ghana. Now, our kind of working thesis has been that when looking at the issues of climate change and the transition to net zero, the role of women is going to be crucially important, especially within the African context, with them providing huge economic upside for both the family unit and also society as a whole. Now, what we've done is founded a venture studio, so a program which will look to support entrepreneurs who are building solutions which tackle the issues of climate and the transition, but looking at it through a gender lens. So we're really trying to understand some of the problems that West African region faces, but supporting those entrepreneurs who are working at that messy intersection. And I say messy intersection on purpose, but that is a project which is a partnership between Startup Discovery School, but also the Autodesk Foundation in the United States. So Autodesk being the large design and engineering SaaS software, which ultimately enables people to collaborate and innovate on building, design, etc.
Fascinating. Lots of great examples to delve in. I particularly appreciate the one on, the issue of gender, because women are disproportionately impacted by the effects of extreme weather events globally. So yeah, it's really good to take that lens. So do you have any recommendations for governments, if anyone was listening to us?
I think the first stage for any government is to listen, to observe what's going on, and to also see where is the work already being done. So where is the work already being done? I encountered someone just a few months ago, actually, who spent the last 20 years training young people how to install solar panels. Did this largely off his own back, accessed some small funding from, I believe it was Unlimited Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs, but has been doing this work largely unheralded, for many years. And his view is, well, I know young people who need opportunities. I am an engineer for the last 30 years. I can train them in a sector which is growing, a skill set which they can use, pivot, they can leverage again and again. But I would say that he doesn't necessarily have the marketing wraparound to talk about what he's doing. So I think listening and understanding what's already going on. So even if it isn't wrapped, he would never call himself a climate-focused entrepreneur at all. So I think it's about listening. I think inclusivity and bringing people to the table. And I'd say that in a formal way, bringing key influencers, and I use that word influencer wide, people already doing the work, influencing, the marketplace, society as a whole, bringing them to the table and ensuring that those communities that typically are left behind have a voice. Can't just build for people, but build with people. And I think thirdly, I'd also add incentive, that the messaging often is, as I said earlier, do less or conserve. I think we really need to do a lot to really talk widely about the upcoming opportunities as well as the uncertainty, because there's nothing guaranteed. But we can make some informed guesses. We can make some predictions on the future. These sectors, clean energies to become more and more important, or alternative accesses to energy. There's going to have to be more education around climate as perhaps, we get an increase in weather events for the next generation. They're going to have to understand, the link between our actions and consumption and what's going on around us. So there's great opportunities for education. And again, some people are already doing this work, already doing a lot of climate education for young people. So I think it's about, listening, what's already going on, bringing people to the table. So establishing forums where communities can actually share the challenges they're facing. And I think thirdly, reshaping the message and leading that and not being afraid. I think sometimes much of the backlash comes through a misunderstanding of what's actually going on. And the same way DE&I, in the last week, I've heard so many people talk about it as, a radical left-wing movement to disenfranchise men, typically, white men, opportunities. And, I wonder again, okay, people are always, there's always going to be those, who have those opinions. But I wonder, have we done a good enough message at recognizing what, at its heart, DE&I is about access, providing all talent, regardless of where you're from, your gender, your sexual orientation, your age, your beliefs, the platform. And I think it's the duty of every government to utilize the talent within its borders or territory.
Absolutely. And my final question is really, who holds the responsibility for the just transition? Is it the governments, the businesses, the citizens?
I would say it's not equal. So to answer your question, everyone. However, again, equity, right? Not everyone has the same power in those stakeholders that you mentioned. I don't have the same power as a nation state, for example. But I think everyone has a role to play. World Economic Forum, some research they released around jobs, they talked about, I think it was about 28% of all jobs will be impacted by the transition to net zero before 2030. in some way there's going to be impact. So everyone's going to feel it, or at least, a large percentage of the working population, both here and elsewhere, will feel it over the next few years. And that's undeniable. There was other stats released, I think it was by the UK government, but there was an interesting kind of stat they released around kind of the cost of transition to every household is around kind of £3,000 to £4,000. But I can't remember, I think it's over about 40% of all adults in the UK or working adults have less than £1,000 in savings. So there's a great kind of economic disparity. But to go back to that question, the idea is everyone has a role. So all of those parties are responsible. However, they are not equally responsible. And I think it's upon the government to provide that direction or kind of leadership. This is a direction of travel. It's for citizens to play their own small parts in that, but also communities to get organized, to take steps forward. It's for the finances to direct more funding towards opportunity. And if you take the learnings of kind of DE&I, opportunity can often be hidden. Talent is there, but opportunity isn't always there. So I think it's multifaceted in terms of responsibility, but not all those parties are equal.
Thank you, Gosbert. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope our listeners enjoyed it too. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks to our listeners to once again tune in. Don't forget to follow us on our social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and why not give us a rating on your favorite platform. See you next week.